So this paper fits in the literature that starts looking at development of children cognitive and non-cognitive skills. We start with the observation that very often what we call cognitive skills are often measured through assessment. They tend to be maybe not perfect, but they tend to be at least objective. We notice instead that the non-cognitive skills are often measured through subjective, somewhat subjective survey questions. And even more interestingly, these survey questions are not asked to the children. The children are too young to answer themselves these questions. And normally the person that answers this question is the mother. So we started thinking about the fact that these answers might actually be contaminated by the characteristics of the mother, or in general, the rater that's actually that's answering to this type of question. To give an example of what we're after, take the same type of child with the same type of skills. A mother with mental problems might see actually the child as more problematic than another mother that instead doesn't have mental problems. So therefore, we think that the measure that we observe might actually be not only a function of the characteristics, the traits, the skills of the child, but also directly and in a contaminated way of the characteristics of the mother. And of course, if this measure is contaminated by the characteristics of the mothers, because the characteristics of the mother also affect the formation of skills for the child, then we're going to have trouble when we try to estimate these models of human capital formation. So that's exactly what we do in this paper. We start showing that it's likely that this contamination appears, it's present in the data. We show that under certain conditions, we can identify and estimate a model that allows for the presence of this contamination. And of course, one of the crucial things that we're going to need is to have multiple raters, multiple people answering to the same questions. And that's going to be a crucial part of this discussion. Once we do that, we do find that the production of skills looks a little bit different. In particular, non-cognitive skills are less persistent, and maternal skills become more important once we take into account this contamination effect. But maybe the most interesting thing that we're going to talk about at the very end of the presentation is that some type of policies that affect simultaneously the children and the mothers might actually look different if we control for this contamination. So some type of effects of policy, we're going to talk about childcare expansions, for example. The impact that these type of policies have on the children might actually be overestimated by the fact that these policies also affect directly the mother. Literature review. There's, of course, a large literature that looks at how parents affect children. These are just a few papers, there's way more than these. Maybe also interesting to talk about the fact that we're not the first to think about that measures might be systematically biased. There's a few examples in the literature, in particular in the psychometric applied statistics fields, where they think about the rater effect. As I'll talk about later, we are quite different from that literature in the fact that we allow this rater effect to be correlated with the characteristics of the child. And therefore create additional issue. I'll be clear about that later on. Go ahead.
Quick question. For just these measures in general, are there concerns that there's just kind of maybe some cheap talk effect in that, for the younger children, all parents just think their kids are awesome and report very high scores overall?
That's
maybe there's less noise among more skilled parents that they give more accurate.
Yeah, that's indeed the type of discussion of that paper, where they see, in that paper in particular, which is maybe the closest to what we're doing, they have professionals rating the children, and they claim that those are error-free, bias-free, et cetera, and they compare to the parents, and they see that the parents tend to be optimistic, et cetera, et cetera. In general, in this literature that we're going to focus on, where we estimate these models that extract information from the measures, all of these effects are allowed to be in there. The like shift up and down of these signals and how precise the signals are. These are things that automatically are taken into account in the estimation. So yeah. And again, I'll show you what I mean later on once I show the measurement equations. So we are able to do what we are doing because we're using this data set. We're using the Millennium Cohort study that follows children that are born in one cohort, in the 2000-2002 cohort in the UK, is representative of the sample, is representative of the UK. We start with around 18,000 children after the sample selection. We end up with 12,000. One of the sample selection that's more stringent is the fact of having intact families. It's not necessary for our discussion, but it's nice to do that because we're also going to compare what the father are saying, not just what the mothers are saying. And very crucial is that we have multiple noisy measure of skills. Going back to what you were saying, Jason, if you have multiple measures, then you can extract the signal that's behind in general.
Intact families at birth or intact families throughout the whole life?
We haven't done the estimation of everything separately in that, but they're including the sample until they're intact. So if at a certain point the family splits, they disappear from the sample. We run regression in all the descriptive sample both ways with throughout intact families, and the results are identical. So we thought that we were happy with this robustness control, and we stopped there. But yes. Measure of child cognitive skills. There's plenty of measure. In particular, we have the British ability scales that measures things like pattern comprehension, word reading, verbal similarities. But we're going to use essentially all the cognitive skills cognitive measure of skills that we observe in this data set. For interestingly, differently from some American data sets, we also observe every single period the non-cognitive skills of the mothers and the fathers. Well, first of all, mothers and fathers, which is already something interesting. And also, it's not just one shot, 1 year, but we can observe it year after year. So we can study also the dynamics of the non-cognitive skills, the mental health and life satisfaction of the parents. Unfortunately, this data set doesn't have rich information about the cognitive skills of the parents, and we are just using years of education, essentially. So here's where the fun begins. When we start talking about how non-cognitive skills are measured in this data set. We're going to have 3 different types of raters. We're going to have the parents. Every single period, we're going to see the parents that are going to answer questions, and these type of questionnaires are, in particular, the strength and difficulty questionnaire, which is relatively common. It's considered a good measure for children on cognitive skills. But there's also other questionnaires, questions about more general child social and behavioral with information about this child social behavior. So the parent, every single wave is asked. They're asked. One of them is asked about these questions. So we're going to use 3, 5, and 7 years old. When the child is 3 years old, the interviewer actually reports directly information about how the child behaves. So whether the observed behavior, in particular attention, cooperation, and things like that. So we're going to use that as one measure of as measures of child non-cognitive skills. And later on, from the age of 5, when in England everybody starts going to school, we observe a lot of information from the teachers directly. So, and in particular, these sets of questions on the non-cognitive skills do not fully overlap, but definitely they overlap to some extent. And that's an interesting feature that allows us also to compare one-to-one the type of questions. We have an identifier, yes, but not for all years, only for 1 year. So we end up not using much. We do use it in the robustness when we check for a few things, but we don't use it in the full model because it's only, we don't. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna split the presentation from now on in a couple of parts. In the first part, I'm just gonna show you a few regressions to motivate what we're gonna do afterwards. And this regression, therefore, will basically give you an idea that this contamination exists, although we will be left with plenty of questions afterwards, but hopefully will be dealt with the full model that we're going to present right after. So what are we going to do in this preliminary data analysis? We're going to do something super simple that's very often done in the literature. We take the principal factor out of these measures that we have. And we use this principal factor as a measure of the child's skills and the parent's skills and et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to have this principal factor for the cognitive skills of the child. We're going to have the principal factor for the non-cognitive skills of the child as reported by the parents. And we're going to have also the version that's derived from instead the teacher or the interviewer. And plus, we're going to have the non-cognitive skills principal factor for the non-cognitive skills of the parents. So we're going to, the idea that we have here is that we're going to run a few regressions. We're going to look at a few conditional correlations. In particular, we're going to use in different set of regressions these two measures of the same skills to some extent of the child. Yes?
You're thinking about some of your past take on this. A lot of this may depend upon what peer group they're comparing to. So when we think about the teachers and interviewers I guess in particular, they're seeing people from lots of different social classes or SES backgrounds, whereas others might be seeing people. How should we think about that effect too?
So that's definitely a problem in this type of analysis, in the sense that in here we don't have the richness to think about what you're describing. Once we go to the model, the measurement equation that we're going to write down will allow for how the skill goes into the measure to be different across different type of interviewers, across different type of raters in general. So that goes a little bit in the direction you're talking. Of course, there's a limit to how much richness that type of approach can give you, but at least if there's a systematic difference between the two type of raters, that should be captured by the measurement equations.
So sorry to interrupt, but can you speak in this mic? This one, yeah, because I have a battery issue with the pack you have. I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'll speak here. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Before you tell us your model and try to get my head around your conceptual view of the world, are you going to use these measures to predict future outcomes for children as part of this?
There's going to be also, as of now, we're just predicting future values of the same type of skills. So we're going to look at the dynamic formation of cognitive and non-cognitive skills.
Because I would imagine the parent's actual, what you're calling non-cognitive skills, are going to continue to affect future outcomes.
Yeah.
As well as being correlated with some unobserved measures.
Yeah. Yeah, that's allowed. That's going to be present in there, and that's the complication of the identification structure for this type of analysis is indeed that these traits of the parents are all over the place, and therefore you want to be careful in how you why one simple piece is going to be called contamination and not, it doesn't really have instead the type of characteristics that you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So, so that's how we're going to start. We're going to just run a few regressions. We're going to have both the principal factor that we have obtained using the parents survey questions and using the other group of people survey questions, so the interviewer and the teacher. So as simple as it gets, this is a regression that puts on the left-hand side what we just said, the child non-cognitive skills by the two different versions of the child non-cognitive skills. And on the right-hand side, we're going to put the child cognitive, the mother cognitive, and the mother non-cognitive. This is just, you're going to have plenty of doubts about this type of regression, and you're going to be right about it. Yet, what I'm showing here is essentially that the mother-reported version of the child non-cognitive skills loads a lot on their own non-cognitive skills. While if we actually look at the teacher interview, this relationship goes down a lot. And go ahead.
What's the 80% missing? Like elsewhere is 1, 2. What do you think is missing? And control one, and the rest of cognitive. What's the sense? What are we missing?
This is not production functional skills. This is just a correlation between the non-cognitive skills and the cognitive of the child and the parental skills. So what's missing is what's personal about the child that's not correlated with the cognitive skills of the child or the characteristic of the parents. So again, there's no structural interpretation in this regression. This is just a conditional correlation. I don't know whether that answers your question.
No, it's just that you have control. Anyway, you have control, and you have many controls.
We're going to have regressions where we are going to control also for the teacher characteristic, but I don't understand what's missing. What the Yeah, if I put like previous period, cognitive, non-cognitive skills, then the R-square will go up quite a bit. But this is just a contemporaneous correlation. So, cognitive and non-cognitive skills are correlated, as you can see, but they're not, these are all standardized, by the way, but they're not, yeah. The demographic controls don't do much, actually, in terms of changing the signs. They add R-square, of course, but.
Ronnie,
go ahead.
do you have any round in which you have the exact same non-cognitive skill measure for the mother and the
Yeah. Here it goes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Whether it is worded 100% the same might not be the case, but they're meant to be precisely the same type of question. The STQ, the strength and difficulty questionnaires, here we have fewer observations because it doesn't overlap every single year, but in the year it overlaps. Because as you were thinking, and many of you were thinking, it doesn't have to be the same value if you are measuring different things. So it's much better to actually think of whether you are looking what happens when you are measuring precisely the same type of skills, and that's what we're doing here. Of course, once we go to the model, that won't matter as much as we were talking about. The fact we're gonna estimate how important each measure is for the type of skills we're measuring. But in here, where we just take the principal factor, that's a concern. So if instead we look at just the measurement of overlapping, the interesting thing is that also the cognitive skills load very similarly across the two. So that's reassuring that it's capturing something similar. But still, we have the interesting feature that if we're looking at the mother non-cognitive loads a lot. If you're looking at the teacher instead, the mother non-cognitive loads. It's in there, of course, because it's correlated. The mother non-cognitive and the child non-cognitive are rightly correlated, but not as much. And that's, again, we go in the direction of supporting our idea. We push the data way too much, and we think about what happens when instead is the father that's answering the questions. So in here, only one person. So if the mother answers, the father doesn't answer. But for but for every single child, we have both the mother and the father non-cognitive skills. So when we run these, you see this is ridiculous. It's 400 observations still, and there's a lot of selection. So again, we're just talking about suggestive evidence. As you can see here, the mother non-cognitive, when the father is answering, is the coefficient drops significantly. And instead, the father non-cognitive, although it's here also when the mother is answering, becomes extremely prevalent when the father is answering. So this flipping of whose non-cognitive skills are important when we look at the measure of the child is still suggestive that something strange is going on here.
In this regression, how closely correlated are the residuals of each regression? So basically, the non-cognitive scores reported by each of go back one, one more. Across those two, one the mother reported, one the teacher interviewer reported. How much joint signal is there actually?
In the residual, yeah. I actually don't know. Okay, I don't know. I know overall. A little bit towards the question. Overall, I can tell you that. Overall, I can tell you, but not the residual. The residual. Overall, is the correlation is. I would like to say, in the paper, it's definitely written. It should be like 0.4 or something like that. Okay. There's definitely, going back. You're right. Going back to your point, there's definitely a lot of noise in these measures, as very often. Yeah. And Fabian is right. If you look at the correlation between these two measures, that is to some extent, it's not precisely, but to some extent, it is what captures the essence of the underlying skill. I mean, it's not going to be as simple as I'm going to tell you in 2 seconds, but it's going in that direction. The identification of the model goes in that direction of using these covariances to identify the strength of the signal. Going towards that goal, yes, it looks like the parents' measures might be contaminating the direction that we're thinking, that somewhat the parent puts a little bit of their own inside the answer to the questions. But at the same time, we would like to resist the temptation of just getting rid of this measure and using the teacher reporting, for example, because the same problem that we are facing with the parent, we might be facing with the teacher as well. Also, the teacher might have a contaminated version, which might not be correlated with the non-cognitive skills of the child, but definitely the fact that it has a sort of personal bias inside there is something that we would like to control for and be more specific. We don't have wages later in life here.
Something like that. Like something that you would think somebody with good non-cognitive skills might be able to achieve better things. So, I mean, my point is you have these two measures. Which one has more signal?
Oh, that is going to come out eventually. We're not going to look at the future outcomes as you're thinking, because we don't have future outcomes, but you can look for example, at the next period. So you can start thinking about how much one predicts the future, how much we can, and that is kind of what gives identification to the full model. I don't think so, but we do have the reports from the teacher that talk about how these children are going, how they perform in school, and that's definitely part of the analysis. It's some of the measures that we are using. So the production functional skills. Now we move towards the model that will allow us to deal a little bit with everything. And maybe I'm going super slow. I should try to catch up a little bit. The production function is extremely simple. Next period skill depends on past period skills. And the cognitive depends on all the skills. The non-cognitive depends on all the skills. And what's in here? This is, let's take the non-cognitive skills of the child depends on what? The cognitive and non-cognitive skills of the child in the previous period. The cognitive and the non-cognitive skills of the parent, of the mother in the previous period, and of the father in the previous period. And again, we restrict to intact families, so we have all these four measures here. And we interestingly, it's a byproduct of what we're doing. We can also estimate this production function for the parents themselves. And one thing that we haven't seen somewhere else is that indeed the child non-cognitive, I'm going to show you later, but the child non-cognitive affects the mother non-cognitive. There's a feedback of the child does affect also the non-cognitive skills of the mother. So this is how we're going to think about the measurements. These are the simple measurements, okay? The ones that don't have issues because they might be imperfect, but at least they're not systematically biased. And again, we could have a discussion of whether this statement is true. And there are definitely a few thoughts that should be spent also in here. But for the time being, what we're going to think is that these take the child cognitive measure. We're going to have the measure is going to be the true underlying skill of the child. There's going to be a loading factor, which is different across time periods, is different across different skills, and then we're going to have something like a measurement error. So this is a standard measurement equation in this type of literature, and there's nothing new or different about it. We're going to have similar things also for the parent and non-cognitive. The parent cognitive, as I said before, we're just years of education. We cannot be too fancy in there. But the fun is once we go and talk about the measurement equation for the child non-cognitive skills. Okay, so in here we have the signal, which is this part. Okay, so the measure depends on the true non-cognitive skills of the child, but then it depends on a bunch of other things that shouldn't be here. Okay, it would be nice if we were at least in the error term, in the sense that they're uncorrelated, so you can, once you look at the covariances, you can factor them out. But instead, because of the correlation that we think there are between that, there's evidence that there are between all the skills of the parents and the children, these don't tend to disappear. So these are the cognitive skills of the parent, the non-cognitive skills of the parent. Ooh, can I take the mask off while I talk? Should have asked that before. And then we're going also to allow for some type of different constant and different persistent difference between the answers of different parents. Think of these as a family fixed effect, that it's a residual after you take into account the cognitive and non-cognitive skills of the parent. So you say, so this part is the part that will create issues. So in general, the identification of this model, how does it work? You take the covariance of these with a different measure, and that eliminates, therefore, the measured error and just takes the signal. But in here, because these parts are all correlated, that will not be the case. The teacher will be similar. Also, the teacher we will allow for some type of contamination. And here, it's the teacher effect. So it's going to be there. Think of that as the skills of the teacher to some extent. That maybe also in that particular case affect how they see the children. Now we'll have to make assumptions about that, and we're going to try to do check for robustness of these. But essentially, what we're going to assume is that this T is going to be uncorrelated with N, and also because teachers are different across in England as in many other countries, you change teacher every single year. They're also uncorrelated across time periods. There's plenty of question marks about it, but we do have a few controls, like years of experience, gender, even the teacher fixed effect for 1 year. So we try to check whether this type of assumption is likely to hold, and this seems like it's likely to hold. Yeah.
it's not a more.
It cannot be correlated with T.
So therefore, it means that the cognitive ability of five doesn't play a whole session.
No, I didn't say that. It could. So these are in line with what we're thinking. These are the skills of the maybe let's think of them as the non-cognitive skills of the teacher to some extent. And what we're thinking is that that part isn't correlated. To the extent that these instead is the cognitive skills of the teacher and the cognitive skill and parents sort in base of that, that would be a problem. But for that, what we can do do I have it here or not? No, I don't think I have it because I'm done with the regressions. But in the paper, we run regression where we control also for school fix effects. And at least the regressions don't change. The coefficient, how the conditional correlation look like, they don't change once we include school fix effects, gender of the teacher, years of experience of the teacher, and so, yeah.
So now you're able to get the value added of the teacher on non-cognitive skills system?
No.
That wasn't part of the production?
No. That's not part of it. We don't. The teachers are only observed once, and in the data, for 1 year we have the teacher identifier, but only for 1 year, and there's like 1.5 students per teacher. We cannot do anything about it. So the identification follows to some extent Cunha, Heckman, and Shanak 2010. You need to have 2 measures for each latent variable. That's the standard identification strategy. You have to do a bunch of normalization without loss of generality. There's actually a literature stemming out of this sentence. Are they really without loss of generality or not? I'm going to claim that for this paper, they are without loss of generality because I'm here and I'm saying it. No, actually, we have a companion paper that proves that if you're using a translog production function, indeed, the normalizations that we're doing are without loss of generality. In general, if, for example, you're using a CES production function, that wouldn't be true, but that's not the case. If you're curious, I can tell you about the other paper later. Now, the problem with these identifications is that although they allow for correlation across different time periods, they don't allow for correlation across the same measure. And that's the issue here. There's a correlation across different measures within the same time periods that's driven by the parent skills. And that's what we're trying to deal with. So we're going to relax these. In particular, we're gonna allow for these type of correlation. We're gonna modify theorem 1 of Cunha, Heckman, and Shanak. So as I said a few times, the typical approach relies on taking covariances across measures of the same skill, and that kind of takes the signal out and identifies the signal. But the problem in here instead is that if you take 2 child non-cognitive, say from the parent, as we saw before, you're gonna have all these extra terms. So 2 assumptions allow us to isolate the second moment related to the non-cognitive skills of the child is that the contamination in parent-reported measures is independent of the contamination in teacher-reported measure, as we were discussing before. T and N of the parents are uncorrelated. And the contamination in the teacher-reported measure are also independent across different time periods. Just to give you a flavor, this is the type of covariance where we start everything. If you look at the covariance between between the teacher reporting on cognitive skill in one period and the different period, we're going to get a covariance in the skills of the child. This is what starts everything. You see, it's also like, it's not the variance, it's a covariance across different time periods. You cannot do it within period because you're going to have the T that shows up if you do it in the period. And as you maybe at the beginning you were thinking, just use one as an instrument for the other, use the teacher as an instrument for the parent, that wouldn't work either. Because if you look at this is the teacher and the parent reported, you have the signal here, but you have also the variance and the covariance of the parent skills that spuriously show up in this type of covariance. So we start from here, and then there's a bunch of other covariances that we need to use in order to solve for all the second moments, all the loading factors, and then from there we go and go back to the theorem for proving the non-parametric identification of the full model. We're going to have a two-stage estimation similar to Atanasio 2019 and Agostinelli and Wiswald 2016, 2020. So we're going to have, in the first step, we're going to estimate the joint density of all skills and all the loading factors. In the second step, given the joint density of the all skills, we're going to draw out of it and estimate the production function parameters. So these, from the first step, as I said, we're going to estimate all the loading factors. We're going to estimate all the joint density of all these skills, so we can compute a table like this, where we can show how much of the measure is signal and how much is noise and how much is the contamination. So the noise is just 1 minus the sum of the other two. In here, we just report the signal and the contamination. Again, going back, there's a lot of junk, let's say, in this type of answer. So the correlation between many of these questions is relatively, yeah. So we have, for example, SDQ can have between 20 and 40% signal inside these measures. Here, the teacher, you see how the teacher tend to be less precise about the children, and they tend to be more persistent instead, tend to have a large contamination effect. This is to some extent consistent with the fact that teachers don't spend as much time as parents with their children, at least at this age, and you know, they stay just 1 year, and it's all, yeah, and it's kind of stemming from the fact that these correlation, the teacher reported one, are pretty weakly correlated across different time periods. That's pretty much, they're very correlated across time periods, sorry, within time periods, but across different time periods, they're weakly correlated, and therefore, this has to be the case. So what are we going to do? Going back to what we were discussing before, these normalization that we do are without loss of generality, but we cannot look at the production function estimates because those are not without loss of generality. The parameters that we estimate are a function of the normalizations we impose. Instead, what we can show is that impulse response functions, let's call them, what happens when you increase by 1 standard deviation the skill in one period, what happens to the other skills, those type of analysis instead are without loss of generality. So this is one thing that we're going to look at. What happens when we increase in the first period, what happens when we increase the child cognitive skills by 1 standard deviation, or the non-cognitive skills by 1 standard deviation, or the parental skills by 1 standard deviation. So our main estimates, so where do I want to go? So let's look just at non-cognitive skills, the terminal non-cognitive skills, so age 11 non-cognitive skills. You see that in our main specification, we're going to have that if we increase by 1 standard deviation the non-cognitive skills in the first period, in the fourth period, we're going to have 0.46 standard deviation higher non-cognitive skills. If we didn't control for the contamination and only used the mother reported measures as standard in the literature, we will find a larger number. Instead, if we push the mother non-cognitive skills, we're going to find a 0.10 of a standard deviation. It will be half the size if we don't control for the contamination. That's one set of results. This is a byproduct. There's no really difference between our main specification and instead not controlling for the contamination, but it's still something that we haven't seen that much in the literature, so it's nice to report. If you increase in one period the non-cognitive skills of the child, 8 years afterwards, you still observe that the mother has a 0.12 standard deviation higher non-cognitive skills. So there's a sizable and large effect also of the child non-cognitive skills on the mother non-cognitive skills that persists over time.
Regarding the previous result, I was just trying to think through, is this related to the discussion of dedicated versus triangular measurement systems?
in the sense that if you presented a measurement system in which you consider cognitive skills to be dedicated, but in reality they also depend on non-cognitive skills, you would be incorrectly estimating a high rate of self-productivity.
Yeah, I believe you're right in the sense that that's exactly how it works. In this case, the literature often assumes that something is a dedicated measure, but it's not a dedicated measure. So, and therefore, once you look at how these skills are correlated across different time periods, you impute the importance of one to the other. Yeah, it's definitely going in that direction. Maybe I went too fast now to try to catch up, but I wanted to have time to talk about the last exercise because I think it's the most fun of everything. We're going to think about policies that are meant to affect children, and we're going to think about the type of policies like that also have an impact on mothers. One example that's pretty common in the policy literature is universal childcare programs. Okay, you've seen here in Quebec, there's a famous paper, well, there's plenty of famous papers, Hawk et al. And Baker et al. They studied expansion of universal childcare here in Quebec. But there's also papers in Japan that do the same. And these papers show that subsidized childcare programs impact both the children and the mother. In particular, the non-cognitive skills. That's actually an interesting thing. There's a larger impact, negative, on the non-cognitive skills of both the mother and the child. Okay, I don't want to read too much about the channels, but you can think that this is driven by the labor supply of the mother. So the mother goes back, is more likely to work, and therefore her non-cognitive skills are likely to be affected. And the child. This paper found weak evidence on the cognitive skills, but definitely stronger negative consequences in the non-cognitive skills of the children. So now, if you have the policy affect simultaneously both the child and the mother, then our model from before is suggesting that maybe what we're going to look and say, we're going to say this is the impact on the child. A fraction of it may actually be due to the fact that we are impacting the mother as well. So we don't, of course, in order to properly estimate this type of effect within the context of these policies, you would need to have multiple raters, you would need to have panel data, you would have to, something that we don't have for this particular situation. But what we can do is just take the numbers from these other papers, more or less, look at the impact that these policies had in these other papers, and just see what happens. So this is not it. It's going to be this one, but this is just to show you a little bit how it's going to work and how we think about it. In this policy simulation, we're just going to boost the maternal skills. Okay, we're going to think of a policy which is not the one that we just described, and we're going to think of a policy that only affects mothers. And then we're going to say, what happens to the children? And we're going to look at the strength and difficulty questionnaire, the emotional, the conduct, the hyperactivity, and the peer behavior. Why are we looking at that? Well, just because 4 is nice in a table. If you put more than 4, it will be uglier. But also because these are extremely common. As you saw before, also they are in common between the teacher and the parents, and they are relatively common in the psychology and literature. So if you can see that if you just boost by 1 standard deviation the mother, you're going to have an impact on the child more or less around 0.15 of a standard deviation, 0.10 of a standard deviation, something that's sizable. And the interesting thing is that this is all apparent, in particular in the first period. That's just because the model works that way. If you boost in the first period, you got to wait the period after for the mother to have an impact on the child. So, but you see how this is all apparent. It's not real. It's not a real impact on the child. Then eventually, because you are affecting the parent, there's going to be a feedback effect of the policy on the child, even though the policy affects only the mother. And you see that this starts being, but even 8 years afterwards, these are biannual periods, you see that a very large fraction of the total effect is just the parent. So I'm not that early, therefore. That's perfect. I have 2 minutes for the last table. So in here, instead, we round up a little bit, but we look at the numbers that have been reported in these papers that look at the policy that have an impact of around 0.2 of the standard deviation on the non-cognitive skills of the child and the similar sized effect on the non-cognitive skills of the mothers. They're both negatives, but negatives are ugly, so we're going to put positive. It's you just flip them in sign, but it's the same message. So as you can see here, we see the policy how affects the children, and the black one is again the true impact. And instead, if you look at the lighter column, you're going to see that that's what is being measured also because of the contamination effect. And you see how we have something that's between 15 and 25% overestimation of the impact of the policy because of this contamination effect. So if you ask me what's the connection of this paper with the labor market with friction, that's an information friction that doesn't allow the policymaker to understand how labor market policies have an impact on the individuals affected by the policies, and therefore full stop. So. Measure of emotional and behavioral skills of children are often reported by the same individual, the mother in particular. And we find evidence that these type of measures are affected by the traits of the mothers. So if we want to clean away this type of contamination, you need to have multiple raters. Not only multiple raters, but you need to have other characteristics as we talked about during the presentations. If we do that, we're going to find that the production function skills, the low emotional skills, looks a little bit different as we were discussing. And but even more importantly, we are seeing that our conclusions with respect to policies that have been implemented might actually be affected by the presence of these contaminations. So what should we do, therefore? Having multiple raters is always a good idea when we construct survey questions. So that would be a suggestion. Another suggestion is if you don't have multiple raters, try to use objective measures for the non-cognitive skills as well, like disciplinary measures, days in which the children don't go to school and stuff like that, which seems more difficult to be contaminated by the skills of the rater. That's it. Thank you very much.